Good evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Church. I'm Vice President Academic here at Mount St. Vincent University, and very happy to welcome you here to our last in the series of Sex and the Citizen. Tonight is number 4, and we've been really pleased to have been partnering with the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs on this series, and I'd like to invite Chris Stover, who's General Manager with CCEPA, to come up and say a few words.
Thanks, Elizabeth. As she mentioned, I'm the General Manager of the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, and CCEPA is a joint venture of the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. It provides an arena for critical thinking, public discussion, and research into current ethical challenges in our society. We're here tonight in collaboration with the fine team here at the Mount to present our final in our 4th part of our series, Sex and the Citizen. So I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our board. And as I mentioned, tonight's presentation is the final part of this 4-part lecture series, which was designed to examine sex law, sex education, the sex trade, and sex in public policy. In part 1 of this series, we looked at reinventing the sexual contract and examined ethical questions about sex, marriage, and autonomy. This presentation, along with all of the others in this series, can be viewed on the CCEPA website. In part 2, sex went to market, and the focus of this talk surrounded what decriminalized prostitution would look like. Sex and national security was part 3, and it gave us new perspectives and knowledge of purge campaigns and fruit machines as it relates to the Canadian military. And tonight we conclude with children and sexuality and ask, what is it that we are afraid of? This series will have an interesting afterlife in that all its parts will be loaded onto the website for general public viewing, as well as a resource and other educational applications. So please do visit the website and have a look at any programs in this series or others that you might have missed that you might find interesting. We've left some evaluation sheets on your chairs in the hopes that you might take a minute or two to fill those out, because what you think about what we're doing here is of vital importance to what we do next. So now it's time to meet our speaker.
So I just want to give you a little overview of the evening. First of all, we'll have our speaker, Judith Levine, followed by our discussant, Dr. Elaine Craig, who's an assistant professor at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie. We've been very fortunate to have Dr. Craig be the discussant for all 4 papers in this series. We were so impressed with the first time we twisted her arm and she agreed to stay on. And it's been, as you'll see tonight, it's been wonderful because she really brings her knowledge of constitutional law, in particular around the Charter of Rights, to bear on these issues, and it's been very illuminating. After the talk, and the discussant, there'll be time for questions, and then you're invited to a reception next door, just across the hall, and Ms. Levine's books will be for sale. So we are really delighted when Judith Levine agreed to be a speaker in our series. The topic of children's sexuality evokes strong reactions. Some people argue that we should do more to protect children from exposure to sex and sexuality, while others argue that we protect children by educating them. I'll just give you one example. In 2008, our federal government raised the legal age of sexual consent from 14 to 16 under their Tackling Violent Crime Act. It was the first time it had been raised since 1892. The government's rationale was that the age of consent needed to be raised in order to protect younger adolescents from sexual exploitation. Others have argued that this law has actually put younger adolescents at more risk because they're afraid to come forward as a result of the law. Ms. Levine is perfectly situated to help discuss these issues. Her 2002 book, Harmful to Minors, The Perils of Protecting Children from Sex, sparked huge controversy. Conservative commentators heavily criticized her work. The University of Minnesota Press, which published the book, received hate mail, and I believe it was discussed in her book was discussed in the Minnesota legislature. On the other hand, her book was widely praised by sex educators and advocates. Dr. Jocelyn Elders, the Surgeon General of the U.S., wrote the foreword and called the book a vitally important book. It won the 2002 Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was named by the Sexuality, Information, and Education Council of the United States of one of history's most influential books about sexuality. Ms. Levine, sorry. Ms. Levine has written 3 other books and hundreds of articles. She's a journalist, an author, feminist, peace activist, and has been very involved in human rights and civil libertarian issues. Please join me in welcoming Judith Levine.
Thank you. This is the first time I'm doing a PowerPoint, so if I mess it up, you will forgive me. The age of consent in the U.S., by the way, is 18 in most places. It also was raised from 14, 16. It's been raised, every few years. And there's a law now. Somebody in Massachusetts tried to pass a law saying that no one over 60 could be photographed sexually with or without that person's consent, and no disabled person of any age. So the age of consent is now, I don't know, it's between 18 and 59. Luckily that didn't pass. The same woman also proposed a law that would make the fluffernutter. Do you have fluffernutters here? It's marshmallow and peanut butter sandwiches. The fluffernutter would be the official sandwich of Massachusetts. And when that was voted down, she's brought it up every year since. This is Nietzsche, the guy with has a great mustache. In 1885, the year that Nietzsche's book was published, the year before Nietzsche's book was published, Beyond Good and Evil, across the English Channel, the readers of the popular tabloid, the Pall Mall Gazette, were riveted to an enthralling series called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. It was clear that London was not beyond good and evil. This is the editor. The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon reported in lascivious detail about a black market in so-called white slavery hidden in the depths of the city. In what would become one of the most successful exposés in history, the editor, W.T. Stead, this guy, told of virgin girls being sold by their hapless mothers to wicked neighborhood procuresses, who in turn prostituted them to eager, amoral gentlemen for as little as £3 each. Stead quoted many underworld sources, none of whom he named. Here's one brothel keeper speaking to him. Any of these houses would supply children, but at present are very timid. You need to be an old customer to be served. But after all, it is expensive getting girls for them. If you really have a fancy that way, why don't you do as Mr. X does? It's cheaper, simpler, and safer. And how does Mr. X do? And who is Mr. X? Oh, Mr. X is a gentleman who has a great penchant for little girls. He goes down to the East End in the city and watches when the girls come out of the shops and factories for lunch on the end of the day. He sees his fancy and marks her down. It takes a little time, but he wins the child's confidence. In the climax of the series, Stead himself purchases, with a very slight inconvenience, a child, a virgin, for £5. From 1885, we zoom forward to 2005 and another shocking exposé. A front-page New York Times article by another crusading investigative journalist, Kurt Eichenwald, headlined, "Through his webcam, a boy joins a sordid online world." It begins. The 13-year-old boy sat in his California home, eyes fixed on a computer screen. He had never run with the popular crowd and long ago had turned to the internet for the friends he craved. But on this day, Justin Berry's fascination with cyberspace would change his life. Weeks before, Justin had hooked up a web camera to his computer, hoping to use it to meet other teenagers online. Instead, he heard only from men who chatted with him by instant message as they watched his image on the internet. To Justin, they seemed like friends, ready with compliments and always offering gifts. Now, on an afternoon in 2000, one member of his audience sent a proposal. He would pay Justin $50 to sit bare-chested in front of his webcam for 3 minutes. The man explained that Justin would receive the money instantly and helped him open a PayPal account. I figured if I took my shirt off at the pool for nothing, he said recently. So it was kind of like, what's the difference? Justin removed his T-shirt. The men watching him oozed compliments. So began the secret life of a teenager who was lured into selling images of his body on the internet over the course of 5 years. From the seduction that began that day, this soccer-playing honor roll student was drawn into performing in front of the webcam, undressing, showering, masturbating, and even having sex for an audience of more than 1,500 people who paid him, over the years, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Later on Oprah, Eichenwald, the reporter, claimed that the phenomenon was epidemic and, like the white slave trade a century earlier, was hidden in plain sight. He called MySpace a virtual Sears catalog for pedophiles and warned, "Your kid is going to be lured into this." 2 terrible, horrifying stories. Each of them is a little bit true, one of them more true than the other. The first story turns out to be almost not true at all, and I'll talk to you a little bit later about those stories. But in another way, culturally, emotionally, symbolically, they were very true in describing both that time of the late 19th century and our own time. So what is our story? I'm going to bring you back to these stories in a little while, but first let's take a little bit of a tour through history. This is Peter Lorre in Fritz Lang's great film M, about a child murderer. The gentleman with a taste for little girls moved to the United States, and I'll talk a little more about him later in the US, but he began to show his face throughout history. During the Great Depression, there was a concern about an epidemic foundering masculine confidence among men who had lost their jobs, which was practically everyone. A new diagnosis arose, a compensatory hyper-masculinity, which relieved itself on the bodies of small children. The press was full of tales of sexual depravity and viciousness. After World War II, again, the sexual predator raised his head. There were headlines ringing out, "Kindergarten girl accosted by man. What shall we do about sex offenders?" The US FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who's this guy, initiated the hunt for the creature he called a sexual psychopath, a man whose uncontrollable desires were loosed on innocent children. In this 1947 article, the illustration was of 3 little girls in frilly dresses being pursued by an enormous masculine hand. But this sexual predator had all of the characteristics when he was described of a homosexual. And vice versa, gay men were also described as having the characteristics of this sexual psychopath. Little boys were warned not to go into public toilets alone. And if any of you are of a certain age, you probably remember that. Maybe parents tell them kids the same thing now. Children, we have felt, are prey not only to the dangers of the flesh, but the dangers of the mind and spirit. In the 1920s, the moral snare was the dime novel, all about sex and its evil compatriot, violence. In the 1950s, it was comic books. The US Senate held hearings in response to Seduction of the Innocent, a book by Dr. Frederick Wortham, which purported that comics were causing juvenile delinquency. That term was also coined by J. Edgar Hoover, by the way. Within months, the Comic Code Authority was formed, establishing a rigid set of rules for the industry to censor itself. The industry giant EC Comics was all but driven out of business, mostly because they discontinued their most popular and grisliest lines, including Tales from the Crypt. The sexual dangers of the 1950s were not just sexual, they were apparently racial as well. The DJ, Alan Freed, who coined the term rock and roll to make rhythm and blues, black music, more palatable to white audiences, and the ironic part of that was rock and roll was a slang for sex in the African American community. He brought black music to white audiences. The rest is history, of course, but part of that history is in 1957, he was given a television show, wildly popular, and he had Frankie Lyman, who's the little guy, who's older in 1957, and the rest of them are called the teenagers. Frankie Lyman danced with a white girl on the show, and the affiliates in the South in the United States were so outraged that the show, in spite of its popularity, was canceled. So morality marches on. You know, I sometimes wonder how anybody manages to grow up with their morality intact and then turn around and decry the popular culture of the next generation. Anyway, sometimes youth breaks the cycle. This picture I particularly like. It's a chorus line of gay men in front of Radio City Music Hall. And just as in times of sexual anxiety, in times of sexual relaxation, the reverberations reach children. In the 1970s, new psychological and sexual liberation movements created a new idea, perhaps for the first time, that children had a right not just to sexual protection, but to sexual expression as well. Sex is a natural appetite, wrote Heidi Handman and Peter Brennan in 1974 in Sex Handbook, Information and Help for Minors. If you're old enough to want sex, you're old enough to have it. Another book that came out at that time was a 1974 German title, which was published in English in 1975, and that was Show Me. Show Me featured explicit pictures of children engaged in sex play, in touching, masturbation, and so on. When it was brought to bookstores, there were pickets. Some states' attorney generals, those are the highest prosecutors in our states, brought obscenity charges against the book, but the courts upheld its legality under the protection of free speech. Sexual revolution brought explicit erotica to the mainstream. You could now get a VCR and show porn in your own house. You didn't have to go to some theater with sticky seats. Then the women's and gay movement celebrated previously suppressed identities and pleasures. And with them, children's sexuality by some people was happily acknowledged. But these kinds of movements also blow big ruptures in old and to many people desirable and safe arrangements of family and gender, class and race, and also of age. In times of upheaval, the rescuers cluster around those who are considered the most vulnerable. In Stead's industrialized Britain and in post-war Europe and America, those vulnerable people were women and children. But by the time of the women's liberation movement, women were saying, we'll take care of ourselves. Thank you very much. And even efforts to censor pornography, adult pornography, were resisted by, among other people, some feminists, me included. And that left only one kind of person to protect: children. And as a politicized evangelical Christianity began to rise in this period, its attacks on gay rights, abortion, daycare, immoral media were always invoked in the name of that righteous object of concern, children. And in the United States, there's a federal law, the DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act, which has made it a law that marriage is between one man and one woman. The Obama administration has recently announced it's going to stop defending this law in the courts. And the Family Research Council, which is one of the large right-wing Christian organizations, has again brought up in its propaganda the idea that gay men are unsuited for marriage because they're promiscuous, and that also that they are more likely to abuse children, which is not true. Again, the sex monster reared his head. But this predator was not necessarily ravaging the actual bodies of children. He was, you might say, a postmodern monster. The child pornographer's crime was the representation of child exploitation. Again, an unknown, virtually unheard of criminal was exposed as allegedly legion. I mean, probably none of you have ever met a child pornographer, and you've probably never seen child pornography, and I have to tell you, that's because there really isn't that much of it out there. And yet, we believe that it's all over the place. In 1977, before a congressional committee, a woman named Judy Ann Denson-Gerber, who was the director of a child-saving organization called Odyssey House in New York, estimated that 1.2 million children were victims of child prostitution and pornography, including snuff films in which they were killed for the viewer's titillation. Her partner, a police detective from Los Angeles named Lloyd Martin, claimed on one Christian television show that pedophiles actually wait for babies to be born so that just minutes after birth, they can grab the post-fetuses and sexually victimize them. And at this congressional hearing, he said that sexual exploitation was worse than homicide. For decades, therapists had counseled adults who were contemplating sex with children to masturbate to child pornography, which was illegal at that time, but still illicit and hard to find, instead of acting out those harmful impulses. And by all accounts, it worked. But now, without any real evidence, Denson-Gerber and her colleagues began to argue that child pornography softens up the child to be exploited and incites a person to commit real crimes against children. Immediately, Congress passed the Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation Act of 1977, prohibiting the production and distribution of obscene depictions of children younger than 16. And before that, there were child porn laws, but they actually covered children, that is, people under 12. One of the first books to be banned under the new law was Show Me. Before long, clerks at film developing shops were calling the police when they came upon a picture that struck them as illegal. Parents were charged as pornographers, their children were interrogated and taken from their custody. Artists also fell into this net. This is a picture by Sally Mann of her child, especially those who took pictures of their own children. In time, images of children who are fully clothed and not doing anything sexual could be deemed pornographic if the maker's intent was, quote, to inflame the lust of a pedophile. And in 2005, as I'm sure you know, a man in Alberta, Canada, was convicted of child pornography possession for a piece of Japanese manga, comic book depicting sex with children. Same year, Canada made some child pornographic texts illegal as well, I think. Am I right, Elaine? The U.S. has tried to enforce child pornography laws also against diaries and drawings, and those have been challenged, but not always successfully. And I remind you that the intent of child pornography law, which is a good intent, is to protect real children from real sexual exploitation. So what was this kind of protection doing for children? Just think about that for a little bit. As Nietzsche said, danger, great danger, was again among us. In 1979, a 6-year-old middle-class boy named Seton turned the corner on his way to school in Lower Manhattan and was never seen again. 2 years later, the head of 6-year-old Adam Walsh was found floating in a Florida canal. Federal and private money began funneling toward a newly named victim, the missing and exploited child. Hundreds of missing children beseeched would-be rescuers from the containers of that quintessentially maternal food, milk. Local police departments set up child-finding units, which distributed pamphlets and dispatched trainers and speakers. In reality, all but very few of the thousands of children who go missing are taken from their homes by their non-custodial parents, or they run away, or they're what we call throwaways, and those are kids who are either kicked out by their parents, often because they're gay, or whose parents just don't care about them or not taking care of them. But the message was loud and clear. The molester, kidnapper was everywhere. Rumor began to spread that the sex monster was lurking where the smallest children were sent for nurture and safekeeping, nursery school. And now he was joined by an omnipotent ally, Satan himself. In 1984, the media followed breathlessly as a year-long trial unfolded in Southern California of the previously beloved proprietors of the McMartin preschool, who were now being accused by 3-year-olds of bizarre tortures, anal rape with knives and pencils, animal mutilation, oral sex performed by clowns, satanic ritual abuse, allegedly carried out in broad daylight in classrooms where people could come and go at will. Eerily identical tales began to surface in schools across the nation and then across the world, too. And then children went on the internet. No longer could a child be safe if she avoided dark alleys or if he kept out of public toilets, if the mother stayed home from work and kept the child from nursery school. Now terror was reaching right into the home. Now, depictions of, this is The Little Rascals. Does any of you young people know about The Little Rascals? It was a very, very popular series from the 20s, like I think through the 50s. And this is Darla, the little girl on the left, and Spanky and Darla. And so, depictions of children in sort of gendered, sexual kind of roles is part of the popular culture, has been for a long time. And she's a little strumpet there, and it just shows that no one can resist a man in uniform. So it's been part of, I like how he looks so sort of concerned about her. So it's been part of mainstream culture and, not so mainstream culture. This is beauty pageant. This is John Benet Ramsey. You remember the little girl who was killed maybe by her parents in 1996. And I, too, am troubled by these very narrow ideas that shape children into a kind of adult idea of, sexiness. I would call it, though, sexism or objectification, maybe rigid gender structures, maybe adultification, if you want to coin a really ugly word. But it's been called recently sexualization by feminists and others, as if kids had no sexuality until adults came along and imposed it on them. Now, playing sex is so common around the world that anthropologists have a name for it. It's called sexual rehearsal play. And, everything that adults do, kids at least make it look like they're doing. And it was no surprise to me that the people who most fervently have embraced this campaign against sexualization have been the religious right. And they've applied the term to people, whether they're 6 or 15. This is Miley Cyrus in a picture by Annie Leibovitz in Vanity Fair, 2008. Or, like this cast member of the TV show Glee. Do you have Glee here? In their mid-20s. This woman, yes, she plays a teenager on television, and this picture is kind of retrograde. But depicting teenagers is depicting teenagers as sexual beings sexualization, and is the picture of a 23-year-old model what it's being called child pornography. I think the interesting thing about this is here's an adult looking like a child, with the lollipop and the knee socks and the rest. What are we protecting? The French social historian Philippe Ariès famously said that the child was an invention of the 18th century. Before that, a person could be a scullery maid or an apprentice at the age of 5, a parent at the age of 13 or 14, a soldier at 16, a householder at 22, and dead by 30 or 35. Then in the 18th century came the Romantic era, and with this, the idea of child innocence. The Romantic era figured children innocent of worldly corruption, such as politics. But I want to just point out to you, you might notice the rose in a strategic place and the spike. I don't know whether that was intentional or not. In the 19th century, innocence was figured, the Victorian era, as specifically sexual. And then, this is a 19th century French painter, Meunier, then said the literary critic James Kincaid, a big dilemma arose. Because in the same era was constructed a new image of Eros, sweet, soft, passive, and pink. Now, of course, before Eros, the cherub was the sender of, the erotic arrow toward adults, but he himself was a baby. He wasn't considered sexy himself. He was just, the messenger. In other words, childhood innocence and erotic beauty, said Kincaid, had the same attributes. Sexiness was childlike, childishness was sexy. And that, again, that Glee picture, with the lollipop. Sexiness was cute, cuteness was sexy. Innocence was seductive. And this is a picture by Charles Dodgson, also known as Lewis Carroll, of the Little Sisters, taken in 1850. Then the one on the left is Alice. She's Alice in Wonderland. But we couldn't get enough of this thrillingly contradictory feeling on the one hand. This is Maxfield Parrish's Daybreak, this picture of kitschy, sexy innocence, which was painted in 1922 and went through many, many iterations and was the most purchased image in the 20th century in North America. Yet our desire for what Kincaid calls erotic innocence was also morally intolerable to us. We repulsed ourselves. What he said was, we had to create a monster onto whom to project this attraction to children, the white slaver, the child molester, the pedophile. But of course, we can't get enough of the pedophile either. Kincaid calls child abuse the unspeakable crime about which we cannot stop speaking. This is Michael Jackson's You Are Not Alone, which was made in 1995, which was a remake of Maxfield Parrish's image of pure innocence. It sold 120,000 copies in the first week, the song did. Went platinum very soon after that, million copies in the US, and it sped to the top of the charts everywhere in every major market except for Italy. We can't explain that. Who is Michael Jackson? We all have very complicated feelings about him, children, pedophilia, and the rest. But I ask you, might Michael Jackson be us? I thought I'd show you a real picture of child abuse. But we cannot get enough of the pedophile either. Oh, I said that. Amy Adler, who is a Columbia University legal scholar, has a provocative answer to who is Michael Jackson? Is he us? When the law requires us to judge images based on their hypothetical appeal to a pedophile, she says, we adopt unintentionally what she calls the pedophilic gaze. She says, what does it do to children to protect them by looking at them as a pedophile would, to linger over depictions of their genitals? What does it do to us as adults to ask these questions when we look at pictures of children? She continues, as everything becomes child pornography in the eyes of the law, clothed children, coy children, children in settings where children are found, perhaps children themselves become pornographic. I interrupt this horror show to bring you a few slightly less titillating facts. London in the 19th century was indeed a hell for poor children. They were weakened by disease, they were worked to death in factories, and in fact, in factories, young women were often the victims of sexual harassment and exploitation. But theirs was not really the hell described by W.T. Stead. Although adult prostitution did flourish, the throngs of child prostitutes claimed by London's anti-white slavery campaigners were, in the words of the historian Judith Walkowitz, imaginary products of sensational journalism intended to capture the attention of a prurient Victorian public. W.T. Stead's 5-pound virgin, the one he bought, he staged that abduction. Rates of child prostitution were also inflated in the United States. One figure reported in the New York suffragist press was multiplied tenfold from probable reality. And these reports were also colored quite literally with xenophobia in a period of massive immigration to the United States. In the 1891 annual report of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, for instance, there were reports of rings of Italian padrones trafficking in child labor, bawdy entertainment, and young flesh. A rabbi is described running a beer bottle-strewn gambling den behind a bogus bird store. He is characterized, oddly, by his little Chinese ways of enticement. That's just a shoehorn in another racist stereotype. During the Great Depression, men did in fact suffer psychologically, and children did too. But their sufferings were not, as far as we know, sexual. As during the late 19th century, the crime records show no increase of sexual violence against children during the 1920s and 30s. No big sex crime wave hit the 1950s either. Do you younger people know what this picture is? This is Father Knows Best. Father Knows Best was probably the most popular television show in the US, probably in Canada too. I don't know if Canada had it. And it, it was about the perfect family having, little tiny crises. Anyway, there was no big crime wave against children in the 1950s unless it was happening in those happy families in their suburban homes. Until feminists exposed the incest in the 1970s, we didn't know that at least 3/4 of child abuse is perpetrated by family members, and perhaps more so in families where father knows best. My own analysis of why the sex panic happened in the 1950s was that during the war, women were manning the factories. Young people were the breadwinners and looking after their families. Sexual mores were relaxed quite a lot. It's probably likely that those teenage boys were having sex with those adult women while their guys were overseas, and while the guys were overseas, they were having sex with European women. And when they came back, it was time to push women back into the kitchen and children back into childhood. And this was there was a bunch of new crimes that were invented about teenagers. Juvenile delinquency was one, which consisted of what J. Edgar Hoover called street corner loitering. That was a crime. And teenage girls were much more likely to be locked up for what was called sexual delinquency, which was promiscuity, or even like thinking about having sex. What about satanic ritual abuse? In 1994, the US government's National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect reported on a 5-year survey of 11,000 psychiatrists and police nationwide, covering more than 12,000 accusations of satanic ritual abuse. The investigation found not a single case where there was clear corroborating evidence. The investigation found not a single snapshot or negative of these alleged rolls and rolls of child pornography, not a hair, not a bone, not a black candle. Debbie Nathan and Mike Snedeker wrote a great book called Satan's Silence, think that the satanic panic was, again, about women going to work and leaving their children with somebody else to take care of them. Child prostitution and child pornography, numbers are maddeningly hard to pin down for many reasons. Rhetoric and sensational pictures like this confound the facts. Legal definitions of sexual assault vary widely, and as I've said, child pornography includes the pictures in your family albums. Nevertheless, careful scholars have tried to count, figure out what the figures are, and have found them to be hugely exaggerated. Just one example, Judy Ann Denson-Gerber's 1.2 million figure for kids in prostitution and pornography, which she subsequently doubled, was revealed to be the arbitrarily quadrupled estimate of an unsubstantiated number an author said he had thrown out to get a reaction from law enforcement. What about Kurt Eichenwald and Justin Berry, the story we began with? Well, this is a complicated story indeed, and I have to be careful what I say because Kurt Eichenwald is known for bringing $1 million lawsuits against his critics. So suffice it to say, Justin was not a squeaky clean kid. He had a lot of friends. He made a lot of money, and he lavished gifts on those friends. He was not guileless. His idea of a good time was to give away the identity of his clients to other clients who might, in order to give their names to police to avoid prosecution themselves. And he was not a beloved, protected child. His mother, who was a psychologist who specialized in adolescent issues, didn't notice when he got an apartment of his own down the street to do his webcamming in, or that he was traveling with men she had never met. His father, meanwhile, helped him set up porn websites in Mexico. And he wasn't straight. He had had relationships with boys in his adolescence and with young men in their 20s, of which I think he was probably ashamed. He seemed to be ashamed of them. And it was this shame, I think, that Kurt Eichenwald really manipulated when he got Justin to turn on these men and testify against them. For his part, Eichenwald was also not squeaky clean. He paid Justin more than $2,000 when the check was deposited right after that. A long dormant website that Justin had, by now he was 19 years old, went up again. And I don't think this is because Kurt Eichenwald wanted to pander in child pornography, but I think he wanted to prove that these things existed. Anyway, he exaggerated a lot. Efforts at child protection achieve great things. child labor laws, child welfare laws, among many others. But when laws and policies are made during panic, they are usually ineffective at helping children, or worse, they harm children. The tribute of, and harm adults too. The tribute of modern Babylon led to a rise in the age of consent from as low as 7 in many places. It also led to crackdown on prostitutes, both casual and professional. And to this day, the same kind of vice laws force sex workers to work with no legal protection or decent working conditions, and criminalization puts them at much greater risk of exploitation and violence. Among the vice legislation that came out of the modern Babylon period were anti-sodomy statutes. And these remained on the books for intermittent enforcement, as during the sexual psychopath panics of the 1950s. These are men being arrested for that. They stayed on the books for 100 years, and they were only repealed in the 1970s, and that took the entire gay liberation movement to do. The satanic ritual abuse panic broke up families, destroyed reputations, and put hundreds of people in prison. This is Bernard Barron, who was the first man to be accused and convicted of sex abuse in daycare, a gay man at the age of 18. He was in jail, innocent, for 22 years, was just gotten out, and his prosecutors are still trying to send him back. And there are many other people who are still in jail for these crimes. Kurt Eichenwald's story fanned an already raging panic, and the sensationalism of Justin's story surely increased the prison terms of the 4 friends and lovers of the teenage Justin who were convicted. This is Ken Gorley on one of those trips they took. Some of those sentences exceed 100 years. Now, you may think some of these punishments are appropriate, but what do our well-meaning protections do to children? I like this title, Why Are Teens Unhappy? It's like Freud saying, women, what do they want? Increasingly, the obsessive search for predators and victims is pathologizing and criminalizing ordinary child sex play. Children as young as 4 who play doctor or touch their little friends are placed in therapy for touching problems or for so-called molestation of other children. Other children go into sex offender treatment. 2 psychologists who are actually architects of these kind of treatments, who subsequently became critics of them, said, "We have encountered young teenagers, 13 to 15, who, as part of their treatment, have been compelled to recite daily creeds, including phrases such as, 'I am a pedophile and I am not fit to live in human society.' These incidents cannot be dismissed as isolated examples of overly zealous practices, but are directly derived from an uncritical application of prevailing treatment models." A father whose 10-year-old son was adjudicated for touching the genitals of his 5-year-old cousin told investigators from Human Rights Watch, "My son doesn't really understand what sex is, so it's hard to help him understand why he has to register as a sex offender." Hypervigilance against teen sex is compounded by hysteria about the sexual perils of social media. Add these overbroad child pornography laws and you create new crimes, such as sexting. You have sexting here, which is, sending sexy pictures of yourself on cell phone, a practice that is much more common among teens than adults, probably because most adults think, well, where are my nipples going to show up? And kids don't have that thought. But, because kids live online, probably many of you live online, it makes sense to me that they would also live their erotic lives online, and showing yourself to your lover is part of erotic life. Who are we protecting by prosecuting kids who send their pictures as child pornographers? Sexting, I think, is the only crime in which one can be both the perpetrator and the victim of the same crime. There are more than 700,000 people on sex offender registries. An unknown number of these are young adults and teens convicted of consensual sex with minors. The conditions of registry include restrictions on residency, jobs, military service, college enrollment, family life, travel, and even worship. It amounts to a kind of banishment. The majority of states have no minimum age for registry, and the federal Adam Walsh Act creates a national online registry and requires that states list offenders as young as 14. Human Rights Watch has indicted much of U.S. sex crime laws as violations of international standards of human rights, and they single out the practices regarding juvenile offenders as especially egregious. But these are the extreme consequences, so extreme that we may forget the garden variety harms that we do to kids with these sex-related politics. Abstinence-only education. The guy on the left here is Derek Dye, the abstinence clown. And the other guy is Keith Del Tano, the Virginity Rocks comedian, whose idea of fun is to take a kid up in the front and hold a cinder block over his genitals to show how well condoms work against STDs and HIV. They do work, but he says they don't. But abstinence-only education is still taught all over the United States, and even comprehensive sex education has absorbed the ethos of abstinence-only education. It stresses abstinence, and it treats virtually all sex among teens as risk behavior, like driving drunk or taking drugs. These kind of policies, reticence about sex, restrictive abortion laws, lead the United States to have the highest rates of teen pregnancy and STDs in the developed world. I don't think that's true in Canada. And then there's the harm that we don't talk about much, the conflict and unhappiness about relationships and sex. Do you know who these people are? This is Levi Johnson and Bristol Palin, the daughter of Sarah Palin. Did you guys follow this here? Okay, so you know she's pregnant in this picture. She didn't have her baby yet. Now, I'm not blaming adults for the misery of teen relationships. Growing up is a process of trial and error, and everyone fails from time to time. The problem is that these policies practically guarantee that some slip-up can become a life-changing experience, such as having a baby if you didn't want to have a baby. At this point, you might be thinking, boy, are we screwed up about sex. But you might also be thinking, well, isn't sexual repression the way of all flesh? I mean, haven't we always been screwed up about sex? People always ask me, this is usually the first question, well, haven't we always been screwed up about sex? And my answer is no. First of all, what do you mean we, white man, as Tonto said to the Lone Ranger when the Lone Ranger said, we're in trouble, Tonto. North America and Europe are a stew of cultures and subcultures, and many of them are much more relaxed about kids' sexuality than, the Judeo-Christian, or Christian, I have to say, bourgeois cultures of the late 20th century. So whatever Freud had to say, we are not naturally neurotic about sex. So what is it about right now, the last 30 years, that have gotten our North American knickers in such a twist? In The Disappearance of Childhood, the American educator and media critic Neil Postman dated the beginning of the end of childhood to the invention of the telegraph in the late 1880s, which spurred the development of media, and with it, children's access to all the sexual secrets in the world. Without secrets, he said, there is no childhood. Now, in some ways, the secret was always a bourgeois wish. Those London street urchins, the African-American slave child, did not have the luxury of many secrets. That said, there is such a thing as childhood, which in some ways now is much more distinct from adulthood than it has ever been. Childhood in the modern West has its own medicine, its own psychology, its own education, own laws, its own special social spaces, and its own languages. And of course, it has its own market niches. And yet, on the third hand, children today may be more like adults than they have been since the 17th century. And I think this is the biggest rupture of all, which creates the biggest anxiety. So children, yes, they do experience the same media as adults, and a lot more media than adults. They trade stocks, they start businesses, they earn money, and they certainly spend it. They travel. As throughout history, children work, often in the most dangerous of conditions. They're hungry and homeless, they survive on their own. They fight and die in wars. This is a Sierra Leonean child There were 10,000 child soldiers in that 10-year civil war, and the UN now estimates there are 300,000 child soldiers in the world. Children express their affections in physical ways. Isn't that a sweet picture? And like adults, they have sex. For all our talk about the sexy media and peer pressure and the rest, they do it for pretty much the same reasons that adults do. They like or love the other person. They want to be cool. They want to get something. They feel good about themselves. They feel bad about themselves. And because sex is pleasurable. We forget this fact, and we forget it for the most understandable and the most laudable of reasons. We forget in the fog of our own confusions and hurts about sex. We forget because we love our children and we want them never to be hurt. I just find this a very wonderful picture. It's actually a picture of a family bed, people who sleep together. We want to pass our morals on to our children, and this is a good thing. We want them to be moral about sex. To me, sexual morality is really not that different from any other kind of morality. I would want kids to learn to protect themselves, yet accommodate others, to feel pride in their individuality, yet tolerate difference, to balance spontaneity and caution, freedom and responsibility. What does it mean for adults to be moral about children's sexuality? I would suggest that the first step would be to realign our ideas of what promotes children's best interests and what truly imperils them. You see this picture? This is a picture by Sally Mann. It's called The Alligator's Approach. It's a picture you can see of a little girl, naked girl, sleeping in a blanket. And down on the bank here is an alligator crawling up onto the bank. If you look more closely, you can't really see it in this picture because I should have the rights to show it, and that's why it's so blurry. You see that it's not a real alligator, it is a plastic float with the claws and the teeth printed on. The mist obscures the cartoon shape of the alligator and makes it look fierce and mobile. What is the alligator? Is the alligator a pedophile with a child's fragrance in his nostrils, a Hollywood mogul concocting the commercial sex that will invade her fantasies? Is it pregnancy or AIDS, poverty or homelessness? Which are the people and conditions that can hurt the child's flesh and devour its spirit? Which are the bags of air, the mass-produced masquerades of danger? The line between perils real and illusory is not always crisp. As we've seen, a make-believe monster can terrify and tear as effectively as a real one. Yet if we are to guide children wisely as they navigate the waters of desire and violence, we need to know the difference. What will impede a child as she steps into its currents? The hierarchies of race, gender, and beauty that make her doubt herself and despise others who are different. The economic and social inequities that close down her horizons before she is tall enough to gaze out over them. The sexual shame and ignorance that lead to dissatisfaction at best and catastrophe at worst. And what will buoy the child? Knowledge and pride in her body, freedom for her feelings, adult respect for her intelligence, will, and privacy. Good food and a secure kitchen to eat it in, green space, libraries filled with books and computers, families and friends with the time and means to love her without hurting her. A community that cares for its smallest, weakest members as much as it lionizes the aggressive and successful, that celebrates happiness as much as it routs out malevolence. Alligators lurk at the bottom of every child's sleep. Peril is inevitable in childhood, and adults' greatest pain may be the powerless to prevent it. But as children move out into the world, protecting them from sex will not protect them from those dangers that have little to do with sex, but may ultimately make sex dangerous. Sex is not harmful to children. It is a vehicle to self-knowledge, love, healing, creativity, adventure, and intense feelings of aliveness. Our moral obligation to the next generation is to make a world in which every child can partake safely, a world in which the needs and desires of every child for accomplishment, connection, meaning, and pleasure can be marvelously fulfilled. Thank you.
Okay. So I'd like to comment from a Canadian legal perspective on one of the themes in particular, from your talk and from your work in harmful to minors. And specifically, I'll talk just for a few minutes about the ways in which the law in Canada constitutes subjects like the sexual psychopath or the sexual predator or the pedophile, and the inherent danger to children in allowing this and perpetuating this. Before I talk about this, though, I'll just take a moment to thank you so much for your talk and for your work. I would urge all of you who have not already read Judith's book to buy it. It's sophisticated and nuanced and well-developed and a real pleasure to read. And it's work that I think takes significant courage to do, particularly, I suspect, in the American context, but also it would be the case in the Canadian context. So thank you. So how does the law reflect and perpetuate the dangers opened up as a consequence of creating subjects like the pedophile, like the sexual psychopath? So one of the things that I appreciate most about your work is the way in which you integrate the need to recognize and protect and promote children's, the sexual joys and pleasures that children are entitled to celebrate, with the harms that arise through human sexual expression and even more so through the way that we understand sexuality. So I think one of your arguments is that you cannot reject the former and hope in any way to protect the latter. So I want to talk a little bit about the latter. I'm going to talk about the harm side of the equation and the way in which our law's denial of children as sexual beings and its corresponding, I think it is corresponding, construction of the monster pedophile perpetuates those circumstances where things like intergenerational sexual interactions do cause harm to children through, for example, denial of autonomy, through disruption of caregiving relationships. You quote from James Kincaid, who said we had to create a monster who embodies our erotic attraction to children. He's not only evil, he is sick. The white slaver, the child molester, the pedophile, call him what you will, he is not us. And so I think the construction of the monster is in a sense the flip side of a coin, the other face of which is this age of, this understanding of this age of sexual innocence and the social narrative which sees all things sexual as inherently harmful to children, and that the assumption that they're inextricably linked. And legal discourse in Canada and positive law itself contributes to both sides of this coin. So laws in Canada concerning age of consent, child pornography, pornography at large, internet luring, post-release parole conditions for those convicted of sexual offenses, and judicial approaches to the conduct of sexual assault trials themselves are replete with examples of doing this, of constructing this monster. And this legal reality, or this reality, is deeply problematic, as you argue. So constructing the pedophile through law as this discrete category of people, making him, the archetypical child sexual abuser it's a very dangerous misapprehension of what is a very real social problem, the social problem of child sexual abuse. A problem that your work doesn't deny, but I think tries to grapple with in a more nuanced and sophisticated way, and a less panicked and hysterical manner. It's also historical, though. So the problem the problem with this discourse of the sexual predator portrays those who are aroused by or engage in sex with children as atypical, and so under this framework, the pedophile is defined or is understood and defined as different in kind, from most of us who are normal. And the problem with this, of course, is the empirical reality that you point out. Intergenerational sex, which is harmful to children, is most frequently perpetuated by family members or someone else known to the child. It is much less frequent that children are violated by, the pedophile, this aberrational other who's lurking on the lurking in playgrounds and trolling the internet. Understanding the issue as the problem of the pedophile and this widespread hysteria about child prostitution and child pornography encourages discussion and policy and legal approaches for keeping children safe from that other. It does nothing to keep children safe within our own families and within their own relationships. The trope of the pedophile does nothing to promote the need for systemic responses, the need for fundamental social changes to preventing sexual abuse against children. As a result, the focus of these, of criminal law approaches, which are purportedly aimed at, proactive measures rather than reactive measures, are typically oriented towards keeping children safe from the sexual predator who stalks them in the playground or on the internet. So Section 161 of our criminal code provides one example. Section 161 permits a court to make an order prohibiting anyone convicted of any sexual offense against a person under the age of 16 from attending a park or a playground or a school ground or a swimming pool or a community center where children are likely to be present. Laws such as Section 161 target only one very specific and small subset of child sexual abuse. And there doesn't seem to be, parallel proactive or preventative initiatives aimed at preventing the larger category of sexual abuse that occurs within families and social, educational, and religious networks. Initiatives that might not trade in this panic about the demonized other. Initiatives that might promote healthy, happy, well-educated, sexually literate children. The panic and paranoia reflected in the criminal law over the threat posed to children on the internet is another good example that you offer. It's another good example of the way that the law reifies the sexual predator and the need to protect things, or to protect children from all things sexual. You make the point in your book that the internet actually provides one of the very safest ways for children to explore their sexuality. The risk of transmission of STIs, the risk of unwanted pregnancy is enormously diminished when sexual exploration occurs on the web. The federal government's Tackling Violent Crimes Act that Dr. Church mentioned in her introduction provides another example of this legal construction of the other. Its legislative objective, as articulated in its preamble, is to ensure that families are protected from sexual predators. That's the actual text of the preamble to the Tackling Violent Crimes Act. So according to legislators, raising the age of consent from 14 to 16, or the general age of consent from 14 to 16, will make our streets safer for our children, and it will protect our communities from sexual predators and human trafficking. That's their language. The discussion in the House of Commons, actually, surrounding the enactment or prior to the enactment of the Tackling Violent Crimes Act, reveals the degree to which legislators, seek to distance us from them. So I'll quote here. Canada has become, in some instances, a destination for those adult sexual predators who have come from jurisdictions where their age of consent is higher. We do not want Canada to become a destination for adult sexual predators. So the government's impetus for addressing the problem of sexual abuse against children in Canada apparently was the influx of sexual predators from foreign lands. How could it be more us and them? The threat that Canada, will become a hotbed of child sexual tourism. Enacting proactive provisions to protect children from those who do lure and exploit them through the use of the internet that's not the problem per se. Taking measures to ensure that Canada doesn't become the next, Phuket, as ridiculous as that proposition is not the problem. The problem, in my opinion, is with wasting social and judicial resources on these, I almost want to say, red herrings. The problem is about not seeing the forest for the trees. The law, of course, is much more willing and able to intervene in the regulation and surveillance of public spaces than it is, it's more comfortable, I suppose, for judges and lawmakers to speak of and think of those who sexually abuse children as aliens, as outsiders, as others, than it is to acknowledge that it is, it's our social structures, our educational deficits, our systemic poverty, our social dysfunction, our failure to raise sexually literate children, and our families that are hurting our children, not sexual predators from foreign lands. Given, as you point out, that the vast majority of children who are sexually harmed are harmed by family members and acquaintances, drawing a circle around the family, reifying the public-private distinction and identifying the threat as from without rather than within is, it's dangerously imperceptive. And jurisprudence and law that conceptualizes the pedophile in this way, such as, our Supreme Court of Canada's rhetoric in a recent internet luring case about closing the cyberspace door before the predator gets in to prey, contributes to this, problematic discourse. Legal conceptions which promote the notion that child sexual abuse is perpetuated by the anomalous and disordered other are likely to encourage legal approaches to prevention which focus on identifying and containing those others, right? Not letting them on the playgrounds or in the internet, rather than, the truthful, if uncomfortable, acknowledgement that the behavior is common, that it's more often uncles and aunts and grandfathers and stepfathers and teachers than it is sex tourists, and that like other criminal offenses, it's strongly correlated with the typical social determinants of crime. Focusing on child pornography, focusing on the child pornography consuming pedophile trolling the internet, rather than the dangerous and violent landscape of many children's family lives, it's actually much like the way that courts and legislatures traditionally focused on stranger rape and ignored the much more common type of rape, of women and some men by family members, by coworkers and neighbors and friends. This conception does nothing to encourage examination of the social structures that perpetuate this harm. It's unlikely to examine, the possible correlation between child sexual abuse and alcoholism, poverty, drug addiction, lack of education, and other forms of child abuse. The argument that I most take away from your work is an argument about literacy, about sexual literacy. You note that to be moral about children and their sexuality is to realign our idea of what promotes their best interests and what truly imperils them. And one part of that process, I think, is to understand what's actually perpetuating the harm to minors, and unsurprisingly, the sexual harm to minors. And unsurprisingly, it's the same social conditions like poverty and lack of education, and sexism and racism, which perpetuate so many of the other harms in society. And the corollary, as well as another important part of the process, is to promote those conditions in which children can explore and celebrate their sexuality. The richness of your work is grounded in the factors that you identify as so necessary to promote those conditions. Sexual literacy, and more broadly and unsurprisingly, the very same social determinants that contribute to and and detract from human flourishing more broadly.
Thank you, Elaine. My name is Ardra Cole, and I'm the Associate Vice President, Academic and Research here at the Mount. And I would first like to thank both of our speakers, Judith Levine. Judith, thank you for coming here this evening and sharing with us your very eloquent and considered research, comments, thoughts about this very important topic. And Elaine, this has you have woven a thread through this series of lectures that those of us who have been able to attend all have had such an appreciation for. It's just, it's wonderful to at each lecture to hear your comments, and so thank you so much again for your eloquence and your considered responses. So we do have a bit of time for questions. We have a microphone and somebody already there lined up. I'll ask you to maybe keep your comments brief and be sure that there's a question there. And please, I invite you to either address your question to Judith, and Elaine, would you also entertain questions? All right. And yeah, so we'll have questions for a little bit, and then we do have a reception across the hall. If you don't feel inclined to come to the microphone, there will be opportunities for you to ask some questions in a more social setting. So please, your first question.
Well, actually a couple of comments just to further develop what Elaine was saying about Judith's talk. It's not so much maybe the construction of children, but how we use that construction of children to create a greater harm. I think that is the interest here. First, about the anatomy of what you might, Cohen originally called the moral panic, about how that actually develops and works and how we can manage it or maybe preempt it in some way. Because, as you pointed out, Stead's original work was largely fabrication, and yet you would imagine that Stead was alive today, despite that, all the evidence that's been shown about his original work. I mean, just the other day we were told that hundreds of thousands of children were sold into sexual slavery at the Super Bowl. Apparently nobody was actually watching the game. And the whole trafficking discourse is really just sort of Stead perpetuated, and it doesn't matter what facts are produced, people believe. I mean, hundreds of thousands of signatures were raised in petitions online to stop this terrible debauchery at the Super Bowl. The other thing you touched on a couple of times was basically the use of the word children and how we tack it on, so that the phrase women and children becomes almost an automatic knee-jerk reflex. And the greater harm, as I see it, and I'd be interested in some discussion from the two of you about that, is the way we tack women and children on together in order to infantilize women, because what we're really saying is this is a concept, a construction, if you like, of vulnerability, and therefore by slapping the two together, we've essentially harmed all women by saying that they are children and therefore need protection.
Well, thanks to feminism, there's some resistance to that. I would say we're winning. So the infantilization of children, though, of course, as that picture of the Glee, the Glee woman, it's still a trope, of sexiness to be childlike, and it's certainly not a trope of masculine sexiness to be childlike. In fact, I think one of the things that happens in the relationship of, say, young boy to older man is that the younger boy is feminized, and then of course, sort of many common stereotypes of gay men is that they're feminized. So I think the women and children first kind of thing is disappearing in the West At any rate, it's certainly not, in Islamic theocracies, for instance, and certainly not in Christian theocracies. In our, in fundamentalist Christian families, the idea is that the man is the head of the household and the woman, serves the man and doesn't make decisions and all the rest of it, even though in real life she does. So, to me, the bigger current problem is this spreading out of the idea of the child. One of the things that, Elaine was talking about, the true harm to children, the true harms of abuse. But, we very commonly talk about kids having, kids who have sex at, 16 or 15 or 14, some sort of sexual relationships, as if this is always a harmful thing. It is normal for adolescents to begin to have sexual lives of one sort or another. And so that this raising, of the age of consent, this march upward, we do the same thing with drinking. I mean, in the United States, 21 is the drinking age. It's insane. And what ends up happening is that kids don't learn to drink. So they go out and they binge and they get sick and they have alcohol poisoning and all the rest of it. So, there's, and at the same time as we are infantilizing children sexually, we're sending them to jail as adults for crimes. The age of 13, 14, 15, you can be sent to an adult jail in the United States. So we're happy to punish them as adults, but we're not willing to give them any freedom, about their sexuality.
Hi, thanks. Your talk raised lots of questions for me, and there's many questions I could ask you. But the main one that was in my mind is, and clearly there's a parallel between this panic of the pedophile or a psychopath, etc. This is parallel to the view that women are sexually assaulted by strangers, etc. So there's a clear parallel there. This myth of misinformation is perpetuated with children as it is with women. It's false myth that this abuse comes from outside as opposed to within family and acquaintances. So that's clearly improved by lots of empirical evidence and needs to have far more awareness. So your project is drawing awareness to that. I think it's really great. At the same time, I'm worried about where the place is for pornography, because in your discussion, pornography seemed to be part of this panic and part of this problem of externalizing where abuse comes from. It comes from strangers, it comes from these people that are engaging in, pornographic activities, etc. And it sort of puts it on the margins, but you must be familiar with the feminist work that shows, you mentioned in your talk, that pornography actually instills views of dominance and power as sexuality, and it's those views which are perpetuated through pornography that helps facilitate the very sort of abuse that occurs within families and by acquaintances. And I just wanted to make sure that...
Well, I don't agree with you about that.
Okay, why not?
I think that pornography, first of all, child pornography, thankfully there is a very, very small number of people who are sexually interested in prepubescent children. Very small. And it doesn't change. You're not going to look at child pornography and think, boy, that looks good. We have, people don't, most people are repulsed by the idea of having sex with a 6-year-old, 8-year-old child. And that doesn't seem to change. It is true that in the 19th century or in other eras of history, sex with a child was one of the things you could buy. Stead wasn't totally wrong about that, but it was still, kind of a minority taste. But, pornography is a very, very broad category. It's like saying novels are bad. It's explicit erotica. If you look at pornography, as I have looked at a lot of pornography, it is vastly, various. It's not all the same. And there's every kind of sexuality that can be pornographied. It's simply just explicit, just parts. It's not about narratives of love, let's say. So I do think that there is sexist pornography, absolutely, just as there is sexist advertising, there are sexist novels, there are, sexist everything, sexist law. But I think to condemn an entire category of expression which has been with us since the beginning of time, because people actually do, I would say, enhance their sex lives by looking at pictures and having fantasies. That to me is, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I do think that it is always very important for us to selectively look at all media for racism, for sexism, for all of the rest of it, and to condemn that. But to condemn, the whole thing, that there are pictures of women and there are pictures of men. I mean, if you go online, it's easy to get pornography. It doesn't, it just doesn't boil down to men are dominant and women are passive. I mean, it doesn't boil down to that. And then the last thing I'll say is that power is part of sexuality. And playing with power is one of the things that people get pleasure from. And they can take different parts in that, regardless of their gender, regardless of the kind of bodies they have. So that's something that pornography also, works with. I mean, I actually think pornography has gotten worse online. I mean, it's much more homogeneous than it used to be. But I just don't agree with you, and I don't agree with, and I'm one of the people who fought against, the criminalization of or the censorship of pornography. And the last thing is because it's impossible to say what it is. Ellen Willis, who was a wonderful American feminist writer who died a few years ago, said, "If it turns me on, it's erotica. If it turns you on, it's pornography."
Okay, I guess I'll save my more questions for later, because my
But I don't
question-
want to have a debate with you about pornography later,
yeah.
during the reception.
Yeah. 'Cause my question is more about the notion of what sexuality is and how
Yeah.
it can be unhealthy or immoral or wrong compared to perhaps healthy or good expressions of sexuality. So that was my question.
I also don't particularly like the word health when it comes to sex.
Well, people can use
I
it
think
more.
it kind of normal. They do, but I don't. Yeah, I don't. So okay, thank you.
Another question? Yes.
Hi, I have a question that's a little bit about the politics around this. So I think we are in an era where, like, the development of public policy in a response to sexual panic, particularly around children, is sort of on the rise in Canada as much as in the States. Like some examples, I was one of the witnesses to the House of Commons committee who was considering the age of consent issue when they changed it from 14 to 16. Actually no longer called age of consent anymore. At law, it's called the age of protection now. That's one of the things they changed when they changed it from 14 to 16. So there's an Orwellian point about the language there. But what struck me was that there were very few people, activist groups or whatever, willing to come forward to say that this law is either a bad idea or that we don't understand how this law makes sense. Like, what are you accomplishing by changing the age of protection? It doesn't really seem to be solving any problems. And those who were willing to criticize the law were so stumbling over themselves to be apologetic for raising any sort of criticism of the people who said this is necessary to protect children. Second example, in Nova Scotia, we now have a law that requires each and every one of us, if we ever encounter child pornography, to report it to the police, which even the police themselves said, we weren't asking for this, this is a ridiculous way of trying to fight child pornography, but the government was very adamant that we needed to be doing more to fight what was supposed to be a tide of child pornography. So even if I, as a solicitor, find out child pornography because I'm giving advice to somebody who's seeking legal advice, have to report it. Even if an abused spouse finds child pornography on her spouse's part, mandatory obligation to. So lots of implications of that law, but when that was passed, absolutely no critical comment whatsoever, no critical debate politically about it, and no very, very little critical comment in the media about it. So my question is, for those of us who think that it makes sense to ask reasonable critical questions about what our laws are doing around the protection of children, how do we fight against this absolute, I don't know. If you criticize laws like this, you're labeled with the pedophiles, and it's a very difficult thing to speak publicly against. You've been the victim of that. How do we make a space to make more reasoned arguments?
Well, I think it's very hard to do, and the problem usually with laws that come from panics is that there's absolutely no political capital for any representative of any kind to repeal them. I mean, what are you going to get for, like, repealing, being good to pedophiles, right? So once they're there, They make it very, very hard to undo. Arguments that have been made are, number one, for instance, all of the requirements, the sex offender registries and all of those post-incarceration conditions have been found really not to protect children at all. In fact, including the no swimming pool thing. I mean, that it tends to isolate former offenders and make it harder for them to reintegrate into the community, which is true for all ex-offenders. That what you want to do is get them housing, make sure they're with their families, get a job, all that stuff. So in the U.S., sex offenders live under bridges. I mean, there's really nowhere for them to live, and they can't get jobs and all the rest of it. So it's not protective of children. But I have to say that argument has gone nowhere. I mean, one of the interesting arguments, it sort of matters who you are. The women's anti-violence movement and anti-child abuse people have come forward against these restrictions and against longer mandatory sentences for sex with minors because they're fearful that children won't come forward if it means they're going to send their dad to jail for 30 years. So that I think that's an interesting argument is that, in the same, I think the only arguments you can make is it's not protecting children. I'll say this about age of consent and why I think age of consent, this is another one that doesn't go anywhere, but why I don't think age of consent is helpful to children. Because what happens is a kid, let's say a 15-year-old kid, will have a consensual relationship with a person in his or her 20s. Now, it is true that there is a difference in, resources, power, all the rest of it. But be that as it may, let's just say that the kid is okay with it and doesn't feel harmed. The research shows that when minors have sex with adults, some of them are extremely traumatized and feel extremely exploited. Some feel neutral about it. It was, no big deal. And some feel good about it. And in the old days, when there was no gay liberation movement, many young boys had their first sexual experiences with adult men. Probably still do. Anyway, so you get a kid in almost all statutory rape prosecutions are brought by the parents of the child. The kid, it's rare that the kid does it. And then you have the kid having to testify against somebody he or she might like or love and send them to prison. And I think it's really traumatizing for the child. Or I don't want to call it a child. I mean, I do think that, sex with a person, a prepubescent child, should be criminal. But I suggested in my book that the Dutch law, I think, works pretty well, and that is the law needs to be able to balance the responsibility of adults to recognize the differential potential for exploitation of kids and to protect children from exploitation. It also needs to gradually acknowledge them, the right to their own sexuality. So what the Dutch law does is it says that people between the ages of 12 and 16 is their age of total consent, may, if they feel something bad has happened to them, it's a child protective board, it's not a criminal board, or through somebody, and they can bring some sort of procedure against the adult. The parent or guardian cannot do it in the child's name because the idea there is that you don't want parents to have control over their kids. There's a recognition of the autonomous sexuality of the minor, and also of the possibility that person can be exploited. So that you're allowed to do it if you're a kid. If you feel there's any problem, you have there is a body to deal with it. So I think that's a good way of dealing with it, and I think in general, when you look at the realities of statutory rape since the beginning, since the 19th century, generally what happens is the girl is going out and having sex with a boy. The mother doesn't like it. She goes to the judge and says, "Please, would you tell her to listen to her mama?" And the judge, instead of saying, "Listen to your mama," sends the girl to juvenile lockup or something, or the boy. And then, then where are you, Or you have like a married couple. Like there are people who have, families together and the man is sent off because the woman is a minor. It's not the place, I don't think the criminal courts are the place to adjudicate, what are essentially very complicated personal relations. So I think that the only arguments that can be made are those in the child protective direction. But the last thing I'll say is there's a really interesting political movement afoot in the United States. Because so many people are on sex offender registries, there are lots of people who are their families now and their friends. And there's a thing called RSOL, it stands for Reform Sex Offender Laws. It has chapters in practically every state, and these people are going to their representatives and saying, I'm a person, and I deserve to have some rights. I did I paid my debt to society. I feel remorse. I want to change. I want to have a good life. Let me. And furthermore, their families are saying, my kids are being beat up. We're afraid that somebody's going to throw a bomb in our house. So, maybe what'll happen is enough people will have contact. Enough people get put in jail. It's like, the African American community in the United States is essentially criminalized. 1 out of every, 4 adult African American men is in some way related to in the criminal justice system. Everybody knows somebody who's been in prison. And so you start to have an abolitionist movement among African Americans. Prison's not helping us, it's not helping our communities. So I hope it's not going to get to that where so many people have some truck with the sex offender laws, but it's getting there.
Is there anyone who would like to ask a question who hasn't had an opportunity? I'd also like to remind you that this talk and the 3 previous talks are available on the CCEPA website for replay for your viewing enjoyment. And again, I'd like to thank Judith and Elaine for bringing this series to a close in such a compelling and provocative way. And I'll invite you to join us for a reception just across the hall for the next remaining time we have this evening. And perhaps if you haven't had an opportunity to voice a question here, you might be able to do so there. So once again, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for those who are attending in a virtual way through the live streaming. Thank you for attending. And to Elaine and Judith, thank you once again.
And I also just would like to thank you for inviting me and thank Elaine for a very thoughtful and excellent response.